Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring the third episode of the series where I teach you guys GraphQL from the beginning. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, today we're actually gonna finally start writing code in GraphQL. And in order to start writing code in GraphQL, we're gonna start in the backend, obviously, because we're gonna build start building our first GraphQL API. And to do that, we're gonna be using JavaScript, NodeJS, and the Apollo Server library. Those are very commonly used technologies together. Apollo Server is probably one of the most famous GraphQL libraries out there to create your GraphQL API using Node.js, and it has a really good community. So that's why I chose to teach you guys that library. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to build a simple application. I'm not sure if we're going to finish everything on the backend today. Remember that as the series continue, I'm going to constantly be adding more and more stuff to the tutorials. So the project might seem small now, but we'll be adding more stuff which will require a bigger complexity, and we'll teach you guys more advanced stuff later on in the series as well. And before we get into the tutorial, if you guys could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. It would help push my videos to more people, and those who are watching the series, you can see I'm putting a lot of effort into this series. I really like teaching GraphQL, and if you could just leave a like, I would be very grateful. So that's basically it. Now let's get into the tutorial. So as you can see over here, we have like an empty project opened up inside of VS Code. And what I want to do is I want to open up my terminal over here, and I want to start by initializing a new Node.js project. And for those who don't know, in order to initialize a Node.js project, all you have to do is you have to run npm, which is the package manager I'm going to be using for the series, and then you run init. And it should start asking you a bunch of questions, like as you can see over here. You just press enter to all of them, and it should generate a package.json automatically for you, which saves us some time. Like writing this. But yeah, that's basically what we wanted. And now that we have our package.json, what we need to do is we need to install a few things. The first thing we want to install is the Apollo Server library. So I'm gonna say npm install Apollo Server like this, and this library, as I mentioned, will allow us to connect to make our API into an API that serves GraphQL. But we also need to install the GraphQL package because we need it in order to write actual GraphQL language. Like to use the GraphQL language and write our definitions, we need to install the GraphQL core package. So I'm going to press enter, and it's going to install both of the packages. And now that both of them have installed, you can see that they are over here in my package.json, and these are the versions for them. So if you want to check them out, these are the versions I'm using. Then what I want to do is I want to quickly just install NodeMon as well, because I don't want to keep restarting my server every time I make any changes. So I'm just going to say npm install NodeMon like this. And while NodeMon is installing, let's set up over here really quickly a script that when we run npm start, it should actually start our application by running the command nodemon and index.js. So we're going to create a file called index.js, and when we run the command npm start, it should run this over here, which means it's going to run nodemon into our packages. So now that it finished installing, let's start by creating our index.js file. So I'm just going to create over here index.js, and this is going to be the entry point of our API. And to get started, if you're used to using Node.js with something like Express, you will notice immediately that the way we're going to set up our API, it's going to be a bit different. We're not actually using Express. As you saw, we didn't install the Express library. But in order to set up the API with GraphQL, all we do is we first import some stuff from the Apollo Server library. So we're going to say const equals to require, and we're going to require it from the Apollo Server library. And the one thing that I really want to import from it right now is just the Apollo Server instance like this. So this over here is a class, as you can see, and it contains all of the configurations and stuff related to configuring our API to work with Apollo, to work with GraphQL. So what I want to do is, over here at the bottom, I want to create an instance of this and call it server and set it equal to new Apollo server, like this. And one thing that I want to tell you guys is, you might encounter code written in GraphQL that looks a little bit different from what we're writing right here. And it is because GraphQL has a bunch of libraries that do the exact same thing for Node.js and also for React as well. There are many alternatives. The most famous one is Apollo Server, so that's why I chose it for this. But there's other ones that I actually have tutorials on my channel. For example, there's one called Express GraphQL, which is also very famous, and if you want to check it out and use that one, you can just check my video. However, I'm just saying this because don't worry, all of them do the exact same thing, and it might seem kind of weird in the beginning. You might think that you need to learn all the different libraries, but you really don't. After you learn one, it becomes a lot easier to transition into another one. And now that we got that out of the way, let me talk a little bit about this Apollo server class that we just created, right? We just instantiated a new instance of this Apollo server class, and we set it equal to server. Well, for the Apollo server class, it will actually take in two pieces of information. The first one is some type definitions. So let's, for now, just write here type definitions or type devs. And the second one is a bunch of resolvers. Now, I understand that if it is your first time working with GraphQL and you're following the series, those two words might be kind of weird. I did mention resolvers, I believe, in the first video, but basically everything, every piece of data, every type that you define, every query you define in GraphQL, everything you do will exist inside of this type devs variable over here. And also, all of the functions that resolve those types and do stuff like make calls to APIs, make calls to databases, send data back, all of those functions that does that kind of stuff will be enclosed inside of a variable, and we're going to call it resolvers. So what we do is, right now, those two values don't exist because I haven't created them yet, but we are going to pass them over here. And I just wanted to mention that these resolvers are just functions that deal with the data. So like make a database call to insert data into a database, that kind of stuff. And type definitions are similar to the stuff we did in the previous video where you define your types. So I wanted to differentiate both of them. And now that you kind of, for now, set up this server variable, what you got to do is you got to come down here and just say that you want a server.listen. So you want to tell the server to listen. And when the server finishes listening, this returns a promise. So after the server is actually running, we just want to basically grab over here a function, and this function should, let's just create it right now, it should just console log some information. Like, for example, it should console log your API is running, like this, and a happy face. And you can also actually grab the URL from here. So the URL in which your API is running at. So if you want to do that, you just destructure the object over here and grab the URL. And you can use that over here if you want to. We might do it like this by using backticks and then just inserting the URL and doing something like at and then putting the URL over here. I'm just going to put the money sign and the curly braces and just put directly the URL inside. By the way, this is white, but it's because of my theme, but this is a string. Don't worry about this. It's just a string with the URL inside. Now, what happens if we try running this right here? Let's open up our terminal and let's try running npm start. You should see initially that it will crash. And the reason why it's crashing, it's because of what I mentioned earlier. We haven't defined any types for our GraphQL schema, and we also haven't created any resolvers to resolve those data, that data, right? So we need to do that right now. And one thing that I want to do is I want to show you guys a little bit of folder structure and how to organize your GraphQL project. So usually when you are working with a GraphQL project, you want to hold the information related to your resolvers and your types and everything inside of a folder called schema. Now, I've seen this same pattern being used in many places, and that's why I use it. But I gotta remember, you guys, that there isn't a correct pattern for structuring your folders. However, this is what we're gonna be doing in this tutorial. We're gonna create this folder called schema, and inside of here, we're gonna divide it into two files. The first one is our type definitions. So I'm gonna call it just type devs like this, and then .js, and the other file is going to be called resolvers like this, and .js as well. And now, as you can imagine, in these files we're going to write the type definitions and the resolvers that are going to be passed into our Apollo server, which will make our actual GraphQL API run. And in order to actually resolve any data, we need to create our own types. So we're gonna finally start writing our own GraphQL schema that is gonna define our API. So over here, we're actually going to import some stuff from the Apollo server library. So from Apollo server, what we wanna import is something called GQL, which is just a variable that is going to allow us to write like pure GraphQL code, and it's going to automatically translate that code into something that JavaScript understands. And in order to do that, we're going to come over here and we're going to create a variable called type definitions like this, and we're going to set it equal to GraphQL, and we're going to open and close backticks like this. And inside of here, we can write pure GraphQL code. But one thing that I want to tell you guys is that you should see that it's kind of weird because we're writing code inside of string templates, so like inside of backticks, which for many of you guys initially it shouldn't give any syntax highlighting or any code completion, but for me it will, because I actually have like a library installed. Actually, it's not a library, it's an extension. And the extension is called, let me just see over here, extensions, and it is this one over here, Apollo GraphQL. You can install this right now, and it should allow you to have like this syntax highlighting inside of the strings, or else you will just be writing code inside of actual quotes, which is pretty annoying. It looks a lot better when you do it like this. So I would recommend installing this extension over here. And when you do so, you can finally start writing your GraphQL code. So in the previous video and in the first video as well, I mentioned that every GraphQL schema starts with one specific type, and that type is called query. So we technically need to do this. We need to create this type called query, and this type over here will hold as fields all of the queries we want to make inside of our API. So for example, if we have a website and one of the requests we want to make to our API is grabbing a list of users, we might want to define a query called users over here and say that it returns a list of users. If we want to get, I don't know, imagine it's suddenly Facebook and you want to receive a friends list, then you might want to define a field over here called friends, and this is the only way you can actually define queries that are going to be in the front end. So keep in mind that the query type is the first level of our graph. Now I don't want to really get too deep into the graph aspect of GraphQL, which is kind of dumb because GraphQL is made out of graphs, but I'm gonna talk about that later on in the series. You gotta think about the whole API as a graph, and the first level is the query type. Now let's think about what we're gonna be doing. I actually want to create a very simple application, which is going to be kind of like a normal application where you have data about users. So in order for us to have data about users, we have to create a type called user. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a type called user. And to create a type, you just write the syntax like this, like we did in the previous video. And if you recall, the way you actually define stuff, like the way you define the fields for a user, it's pretty simple. So you come over here and you write the name of the field. So a user might have a name. And then you write which type that field returns. So a name would be a string. And as I showed in the previous video, string with a capital S is a type in GraphQL. And we do want to make this field required. And as I showed before, to make a field required, you just put the exclamation mark at the end. So whenever we either create a user or just request a user, name can never be empty because you can never have a user without a name. So we make it a required field. So what we want to do now is we also want to give it, I don't know, a username. And it's also going to be a string. Then maybe the user might have an age. We might want to do that. And for age, we're actually going to be using int, which is another type. And then what we want to do is we might want to have a nationality. For example, we can put over here nationality. And for now, let's say that the nationality for the user is of type string. And the reason why I'm saying for now is because this will change later on in the series when we get into more advanced topics. I'm actually going to make it so that you can only actually pass nationalities, so like actual countries, instead of any random string. But that's for later on in the series. Right now, our type user can only take in this kind of information. And now that we have defined the type user, we can start creating queries that deal with this type. So as I mentioned in the past, we might want to get just a query which return a list of all the users. So let's just call it users like this. And let's just say that it should return a list of the type user that we just created. But right now it just says that it's returning a single user. So in order to say that we're going to return a list of the type user, we just wrap this around with this brackets to say it's an array. And let's make it required as well by putting an exclamation mark like this to say that if we want to grab the users, we want to actually return a list. We don't want this to be able to be null. And if we receive a list, every user inside of it can't be null, so it should be required as well. We're just saying that inside of the query type, there is a query called users, and it should return a list of users whenever you query it. So this is fine. It looks really nice. And for now, let's just keep our API pretty simple. You're only going to be able to make one query and request data about users. That's basically it. And that's fine. What we want to do is we want to actually have some data to deal with. Right now, you can see I don't have any data. And what my plan for this series is, at least for now, I'm not going to be using any actual database because I don't want to make this series be kind of weird for people who use different kind of databases. If I use one database, then a person who doesn't use that database or doesn't understand that database won't be able to follow. So my thinking is maybe I'll just use some fake data, dummy data like JSON, and I'll tell you guys exactly where you should be making your requests to your databases, and I feel like it won't impact the series that much. So what I want to do is I'm going to create a file over here, and let's call it fake data, like this, fake data.js. And inside of here, I'm going to have a list called user list, like this, user list. And what I want to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add the fake data. And I'm going to come back in a second just to show you guys all the fake data done. Okay, everyone. So as you can see, I did generate some fake data. The list over here includes each 5 objects, and each object contains information about a user. And as you can see, the data that I put over here matches the data, the type of user we created over here. It does have a name, it does have a username, it does have an age, and it does have a nationality. One thing that I forgot to add for the user type, which is kind of like a really bad thing because you should always add that in GraphQL, is the ID type. And it's a field inside of a type. And GraphQL by default has a basic type called ID, which is similar to a string, an int, and other like basic types. An ID can take in either an integer or a string, and it just serves as an identifier to a type. So now let's save this, and this is our database over here. So now that we have our data, we have our type definitions. Can we actually make this work and actually make queries to our API? Well, no, because GraphQL, just having this information over here doesn't work that way because they don't actually know what to do when you make the query. So as an example, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to, first of all, export this type definitions object that I created. And I'm going to say module.exports like this and set it equal to type defs. So type defs. And if I come to our index.js, now at the type over here, I'm just going to import this file that I just created. So require from the path towards the file, so it would be ./schema/typedevs like this. And what we want to import is the typedevs variable that we created, and now it's passed on, so it should be working. Now, do you think it's gonna work if I run this application? Let's test it out. If I open this up over here, it actually was already running, and you can see it crashed because it still doesn't have the resolver functions. And resolvers are just functions that resolve queries that you have. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, over here you can see we have a users field, right? So we do need to create a resolver that is going to resolve this field over here. So we need to say that in the side of this users field, it should return a list of user. So how exactly do we do that? Well, we can come into our resolvers function or resolvers file over here, and we can start by creating an object called resolvers, which we're going to pass inside of our index.js. And this object will contain all of the resolver functions that will exist inside of our API. So all of the functions that make calls to databases, all the functions that decide what we return to the front end, all the functions that actually do something in our API will exist inside of this single resolvers object. And the way we define it is we first define what is the highest level field for inside of this object. So in our case, it is the type query. And we just come over here and we write query. So inside of the query type, we define all of the resolver functions that will exist as a subfield for the query type. And right now we just have one field, which is users. So we need to define a resolver function for this users type. And to do that, we just come over here and we can call this resolver functions exactly what I called it over here. So if I call this users, I like to call this function users as well. And it's a function, so we define it like this. We open and close parentheses and we open and close curly braces. And inside of here, we can write all of the JavaScript necessary to tell GraphQL what we want to return whenever someone makes a query to the users field. And that means that if you have a database, it is over here that you make an API call to your database to get data about users, and then you return at the end the data, right? We don't have a database, we have a file called fakedata.js. So what we want to do is we're going to import the user list that we created, like this, set it equal to require, and we want to require from /. Actually, I need to go back twice and then go to fake data. And one thing I just realized is that inside of this fakedata.js file, I did export const. I can't do that because I'm using modules. So I actually need to come here at the bottom and I have to say module.exports equals to the user list that we just created. And I'm going to close this, and inside of our resolvers, we can just import the user list that we have right now. And inside of the users query, what do we want? Well, we did have a type called user, and our field is called users. So it means that we want to get a list of users. So we already have a list of users in our fakedata.js. So all we want to do is we just want to return that data. So what we do is we just come over here and say user list is the things that is exactly the thing that we want to return. So this over here should be working, and let's just export it by saying module.exports and set it equal to resolvers like this. And now we can access this inside of our index.js the same way we did with the type definitions, and say something like resolvers like this. And now we'll just grab this over here and it should already be passed. Since it's passed, it should be working. If I actually open my terminal, you can see that now instead of crashing, it's actually saying your API is running at localhost 4000, which is honestly amazing. And if I just grab the URL over here, localhost 4000, and I actually try to go into one of my browsers, you'll see that this message appears, which is a bit different if you're familiar with something like REST. And what this says is that the Apollo Server library actually has a built-in API tester that we can use. And to use it, you just click on this button, Query Your Server, and it should bring us to the Apollo GraphQL Studio, which is this beautiful thing over here. Now, the good thing is it recognizes that our API is running, and it actually gives you a list of all of the fields inside of the query type. So we have a users field, and it does know that automatically because it actually creates a beautiful documentation for you inside of the studio. You can actually check out more stuff. You can look at the schema and see stuff like, oh, what is the type user? Well, we created this type, and it actually has like a whole documentation for it, as you can see over here. All of these fields we added inside of our code. But if we actually want to write a query as if we were making a request, all we have to do is we have to come to this operations tab over here, this widget, and we have to structure our query as follows. First thing we write when we want to write a query is the word query. Now, this is a bit different from what we did in the previous video, and it is because depending on where you're making your request, you might not need to actually write the word query. However, we do need that right now because we will need that when we use Apollo client inside of React. It uses the same format, so I highly recommend just doing it like this. So you write query as your first thing, then you write the name of the query you want to write. So let's call it get all users. You can give it whatever you want. And inside of here, you specify which fields you want to get. Remember that by default, the first level is the query type. So what is the only field that we have inside of the query type? We have the users field, which is exactly what we want. So we can write over here users. And since users return like a list of the object user, we do need to specify which actual fields inside of user we want to receive in our request. So one of the beautiful things with GraphQL that I mentioned in the previous video is that you can actually select which fields you want, and you can just not receive all of them if you want so. So what we want for now is we actually want all of the fields. So we want to grab the ID for each user, we want to grab the name, we want to grab the age, we want to grab the nationality, and I'm pretty sure that's it. And if our API is working, when we click on this, it should run a query called get all users, and as you can see, it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work is it says there was an error, and it says cannot return null for non-nullable fields in query.users. Oh, that's interesting, right? The reason why it's interesting, by the way, this wasn't intentional. I thought it was gonna go. The reason why this is interesting is because differently from REST, GraphQL has a built-in error handling system. So it actually gives you back the error exactly how it is. You don't need to define anything. And you can see right now it just says that the message is that you cannot return null for non-nullable fields in our API. So it's very simple to solve that. We just go to our field. We'll take a look at what we created. I actually figured out what the error was, and it was pretty dumb. I just accidentally, for the resolvers, instead of importing from the resolvers file, I was importing from the type definitions file. So basically it was like this, which obviously is wrong. So it wasn't recognizing the resolvers. So now that I can save this, let's come over here to our application, and let me run this query again. When I click get all users, you can see that now it actually lists out the list of all the users we have in our application. And since we specified all of the fields we wanted, each user contains each field. But if we wanted to just get the nationality for each user, we can also just get the nationality for each user. So in the front end, the one who makes the request can specify what they want. And I just find that really cool. And you can see that it works perfectly with our data. And it only works because we have here our type definition, we have our type called user. Inside of our query type, we have a field called users, and we have this field, and we have a function, a resolver function named users as well. And you can see that this resolver function is returning the correct data. Now imagine that, for example, we saw over here that we said that for example, nationality was a string and that it was required. So by being required, we mean that it can't be null. Now, what would happen if I made it null, right? So I'm going to grab my list of data over here, and I'm going to make one of the nationalities null, and let's see what would happen. If I came over here and I asked for the nationality and I try to get all users, you'll see it won't work because it recognizes that it received a null value for one of the nationalities, and while it has to be required because that's how we defined it. So keep in mind when you're working with GraphQL and when you're defining your schemas. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. I'm trying to make the episode short. I have no idea if this episode is going to actually be short, but next episode we're going to be building this more. We're actually going to be adding more types, making our project more complex so that we can learn a lot about GraphQL as a whole. And later on in the series, we're actually going to build a front end that interacts with this API. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.